Thank you to all of you for coming on a Friday evening. I wondered whether we would get anybody at all on a Friday evening, but it's good to see that there are some people, at least, not just the three of us in front, who are sufficiently concerned about protecting civilians in armed conflict that they will even come for a discussion on a Friday evening. I'm Dapo Akande. I'm Professor of Public International Law here at the Blavatnik School of Government, and I am one of the co-directors of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, ELAC. This event is organized by ELAC. It's our second event of the year, and it's one in which we hope to feature essentially the essence, I think, of what ELAC does. ELAC was established, I think now 10 years ago, actually. 10 years ago, 2008. So ELAC was established in 2008 as a part of a grant that we received from the Oxford Martin School and was housed at the Department for Politics and International Relations. And it's an interdisciplinary institute that draws on international relations, on moral philosophy, and on law, working on the regulation of armed conflict, prevention of armed conflict, and generally on normative issues relating to war and conflict. And this evening, as I say, we hope to showcase the sort of work that ELAC does. With me this evening, we have Professor Jennifer Welsh, who is one of the co-founders of ELAC. Jennifer was at the time Professor of International Relations here in Oxford in DPIR. She is now at McGill University at the Maxwell Public Policy School. She was recently the special representative? I keep forgetting. Special advisor to the UN Secretary General on responsibility to protect. Also with me is Yanina Dill. Yanina is an associate professor in DPIR, and she is the other co-director of ELAC. And I think between the three of us, somehow, we represent international law, international relations, philosophy, and perhaps even other things as well. I tend to think that Yanina herself represents all these three things, but somehow between the three of us, we cover the ground. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion where each of us will talk for about 12 to 15 minutes on a challenge relating to the protection of civilians in conflict, and after that we will open it up for question and answer and for discussion. So going first will be Yanina.
Thank you, Dapo. And let me just echo, Dapo, thank you all for coming tonight. So why is it so difficult to protect civilians in war? Civilians are often morally innocent bystanders caught up in battle. What is at the heart of the challenge in protecting them? I will propose to you that from a conceptual point of view, we can think of the root of this challenge, that warfare creates volitional defects. What are volitional defects? They are incentive structures or biases that account for why individuals, when left to their own devices, in certain contexts, systematically fail to meet their moral obligations. So if we accept the fairly uncontroversial position that we have moral obligations not to harm and kill each other, and definitely moral obligations not to harm or kill innocent bystanders, then in most contexts, most of us don't have problems discharging these moral obligations. But the idea is that in war, right, in the circumstances of war, most of us put in those circumstances would actually fail to meet these moral obligations. And if left to their own devices, so do most soldiers. So what are these volitional defects that account for why it is so difficult to protect the innocent or to meet our obligations? Two main types. One is that in war, protecting the innocent is an imperative that operates in a zero-sum logic with crucial interests that most soldiers have. Those interests are winning the war and getting out of war unharmed or alive yourself. Right? So if you think about the logic of warfare, very, very often taking an additional step to verify the status of a person and to make sure you're not harming a civilian, or having a higher threshold for the release of your weapon in order to protect bystanding civilians, that will directly mean incurring a cost in terms of your military efficacy and incurring a cost in terms of the safety of the attacker. So the bottom line here is that morality has high compliance costs in war, and it operates in a zero-sum logic with these very, very common incentives that most soldiers have in war. The second type of volitional defect concerns affective and cognitive biases that basically make us fail to discern what our moral obligations require in particular circumstances, right? And here I'm really thinking of the fact that in many wars, right, soldiers are put in positions where they have these cognitive and affective biases that really undercut their moral agency, right? Their ability to apply their normal reasoning of right and wrong to the situation, the decision they face, and the ability or the capacity to act on, to go the extra mile, right? To afford the attention and effort that it takes to actually doing justice to your moral obligations. So I'm thinking of the stresses of battle, the lack of information about the enemy, the proverbial fog, right? Seeing comrades become casualties of war, being under threat, under constant threat yourself, right? These kinds of biases, cognitive and affective, against the other side, against potentially even civilians on the other side, that emerge in these contexts, they don't apply to all soldiers in all wars equally, right? But they are common enough a feature of war that we can consider them to be sort of a systematic feature of the non-contingent reality of war. And these cognitive biases as a volitional defect basically account for the notion that even a relatively reasonable, a good faith actor, if left to their own devices, fails to discharge their moral obligations. Now, what do we do, right, in situations in which we have these volitional defects? Well, our best hope is law, because law can cure volitional defects, right? What does law do if it imposes sanctions for non-compliance? It basically creates a countervailing incentive to compliance costs. It imposes a cost on non-compliance, right? How does law deal with the volitional defect of cognitive or affective bias? It basically tells you exactly what you have to do, right? You may know you have sort of an abstract moral obligation to not harm someone in the outcome of your obligations, but law can be much, much more concrete, right, in its action guidance. It can tell you exactly how much effort and attention you have to put into discharging a legal obligation, right? Unfortunately, and this is where it gets really tricky and where we come back to why this seems to be such an intractable challenge to protecting civilians in war, is that actually law is also hamstrung in its ability to cure volitional defects in war, right? So if you think about the fog of war, right, and the lack of information, it isn't only hard for combatants to discern what exactly their moral obligations mean in war, right, what exactly they should be doing. It is actually also hard for a bystander, for an outside observer to discern that, right? And this systematic lack of oversight, of transparency, of information that war creates actually plays out in the chambers of international courts and tribunals, in the challenges we face in the justiciability of unlawful attack. I won't go into this too much, for reasons of time, but I'm very happy to discuss this a bit more in our Q&A afterwards. In addition to this sort of lack of information, there's also just the, limitation that IHL shares with all international law, right? If the way in which law cures volitional defects is by imposing sanctions, then IHL is limited because it is always, like all international law, its enforcement structures are uneven, they're less reliable. In the case of IHL, we also have to take into account that it actually relies for its enforcement on the cooperation of states. But state belligerents share in the many volitional defects that soldiers encounter on the battlefield, and that keep soldiers from obeying their obligations in the first place, right? Because after all, states also have incentives to prioritize winning wars and to keeping their own soldiers safe. When it comes to affording really detailed action guidance to cure the bias defect, right? Again, IHL falls somewhat short of an ideal, in that some of its principles are rather open-ended and therefore lend themselves to biased interpretation. All law does to some extent, so this is a matter of degree, right? But I'm thinking in particularly of the principle of proportionality, right? Most of you will know that IHL permits killing civilians if this is foreseen but unintended. And the crucial restriction on that, which is really the most important restriction in terms of protecting civilians, is that this foreseen incidental civilian harm, this collateral damage, has to be proportionate to the anticipated military advantage of an attack. And unfortunately, it turns out it's really unclear what that means, right? Experts disagree, right? Normal, reasonable observers disagree. So we have a really truly open-ended law that in some ways misses the opportunity of doing what law is supposed to be good at vis-a-vis morality, which is be concrete and give you concrete action guidance. Now, at the same time, and this is crucial, IHL does accommodate some of the volitional defects that it cannot cure, right? It accommodates them by being, for instance, more simple than the moral obligation. You'll have noted that I said when I was speaking about morality, your obligation is to protect the innocent. IHL asks you to protect civilians, right? It's not quite the same, but it is quite of an effective way of producing a slightly more action-guiding rule, a rule that you may have a slightly better chance to actually fulfill in the really, really challenging context that is war. At the same time, even though IHL does actually, go some way towards accommodating these volitional defects, it still has high compliance costs, and it still cannot really fully cure the problems that arise from bias in war, which is a structural feature of war. Now, what do we do, right? This is so much for the conceptual challenge. Now, how do we solve it, right? How do we address it? If I obviously had an easy answer, I probably would have a different job, right? But I want to, before handing over to the next panelists, highlight 3 potential avenues for mitigating the challenge that arises from these volitional defects in war. And the first is socialization. So if you read the 2018 report of the ICRC on the roots of restraint in war, it's very interesting how much it highlights socialization, right? So fairly recent, I think, for the ICRC to take this on board, the notion of we don't just disseminate law, we don't just teach law, but really what we need is that both state militaries and non-state armed groups institutionalize a culture of compliance. Really, subject their fighters, their weapons bearers, to a habitual internalization of the rules of IHL. And something that the report doesn't mention, but that is very interesting about this, is that there is actually a deeper reason for why this is the right strategy, right? Because if you think about what does socialization actually do, it highlights that what your incentives are, what is your interest, is ultimately subject to perception, right? I mentioned earlier this notion that in war, most of us, if we were put in a war, would have the interest to win and to survive, right? And this is intuitively very compelling, that this is the overriding interest that any reasonable actor would have in war, right? And it obscures in some way that ultimately it is a matter of construction, of social construction, of perception, what you think is the utility you as a rational actor should be maximizing, right? And what socialization actually does, it can change what we perceive to be in our interest, because it can change of what we think of who we are and who other people are. So let me give you an example. Something that I encountered a lot with military practitioners in interviews is that some of them actually would hold the notion that protecting civilians is an independent interest they have. It's an incentive that they have in war, because this is simply the kind of soldier they are. This is the kind of military they fight for, right? Now, we can talk about how robust this incentive is, right? This perceived interest in protecting civilians, if it conflicts with other interests like survival, right? But it highlights very importantly that socialization, subjecting someone to a culture of compliance with IHL, can fundamentally change the range of things that they perceive are in their interest, the utilities they ought to maximize. Right? The second avenue goes some way in the same direction. It is again about the notion of, can we not interfere with this idea that there's a zero-sum trade-off between the interests that someone has in wars and protecting civilians? And what is important here is public opinion, right? The notion that, yes, the most direct way in which law can impose costs on non-compliance is through sanction. But there is another way, right, which is social or public opprobrium. At least for some belligerents in some wars, it is actually important that public opinion at home supports a war, right? I do some research with a colleague at the University of Duke, and Professor Livia Schubiger, and we do basically have found that in the United States, people prefer wars that are fought in line with international law. Whether you give them individual targets of attack or strategies for fighting the war overall, without telling them that what is at stake is legality, right? They will pick, as a matter of preference, those that comply with the principles of distinction and the precautions in attack in particular. Speaking to the fact that potentially publics at large, right, societies can also be socialized into having preferences for the protection of civilians. I'm happy to speak about the limitations of this again, right? But I find it quite striking that this is a possibility. The publics can have preferences for legally compliant conduct that protects civilians. And the last and final avenue speaks to the fact that sometimes the public or the audience that belligerents must bring along with them, whose support belligerents must seek, is actually the civilian population in the theater of war, with whose protection we are concerned today, right? So this depends on the long-term strategy of the belligerent and on their war aims. But any belligerent who seeks to govern a civilian population long-term, right, so in wars of regime contestation, any belligerent who seeks to win hearts or minds, right, must worry about the disaffection that civilian harm causes to a population on which it is inflicted. The long-term disaffection and the delegitimization of the aims of a belligerent harming the civilian population. Right? Again, this doesn't apply to all belligerents in all wars. Right? Not even all belligerents who seek to govern the civilian populations that they harm in the war that they're fighting. And here the case of the Syrian regime under Assad is a very sad case in point. Right? But it is another example of how an avenue through which we can basically change or hope to change the incentive structures of both soldiers and belligerents in war towards mitigating this notion that there's a zero-sum logic between protecting civilians and what the reasonable, rational actor should consider their goals in war, right? And I think if we understand that the conceptual challenge to protecting civilians in war is this notion that war creates systematically these volitional defects, then I think that is one of the right ways of thinking about this, right? And this creates implications for us as scholars, for the kind of questions we want to ask. It creates implications for civil society organizations like the ICRC, but it also creates implications for ordinary citizens, particularly in democratic states that wage war, and in terms of the kind of public opinion we want to communicate. Right? And again, if we understand that the conceptual challenge at the heart of protecting civilians is the volitional defects that soldiers encounter, then we must also understand that IHL to some extent is our best bet. Then, because even though it is limited in curing these volitional defects, right, ultimately it is law that you need to accommodate and mitigate and prod volitional defects to recreate incentive structures in which we can better protect civilians. All right.
Thank you very much, Janina. Jennifer?
Great. Good evening. Very nice to be here and have another opportunity to talk in a format where we look at the question from different perspectives. I wanted to talk about challenges to civilian protection that sort of funnel down from the macro context in which we're operating in today, and I'm talking here about norms that exist at the international level that favor protection. Secondly, to look at a more intermediate level at the crisis of compliance that we actually have, the race to the bottom in terms of respect for IHL and norms of protection. And then lastly, to look at this a little bit differently, and I'll just spark your interest in this, in turning the question around and thinking about civilians engaging in self-protection. How do we understand, rather than thinking about this as what we or others do to protect civilians, how is it that they actually protect themselves? And what can we, from the outside, potentially do to assist that without actually undermining what they try to do to protect themselves? So when we look at the macro level to begin with, we started in the early post-Cold War period with a big normative push to emphasize the protection of civilians. Yes, the principle of distinction had long been part of international humanitarian law, but we began to talk in the mid-1990s in the international community, within the UN system, within member states, about the protection of civilians. And that normative agenda was born out of failure, perceived failure. Huge instances in which large populations of either combatants who were hors de combat or civilians were massacred. And I'm thinking here specifically of the catalysts of Rwanda and Srebrenica. You had a set of normative developments all beginning at the same time, in a sense, even though they had some early flickerings in previous decades. You had an agenda within the Security Council to prioritize protection of civilians in peace operations. So the goal of peacekeeping was no longer to keep warring factions apart, to be a neutral player in between, but rather specific mandates to protect civilians, no matter who was infringing on the rights of civilians, no matter which party. It was very striking. From the late 1990s onwards, peacekeeping missions began to have those mandates. And then we had, at the turn of the millennium, the development of the principle of the responsibility to protect, which was about protecting populations from specific crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. Now, as I say, they both norms arose out of the experience of failure, and they had initially very different institutional homes. You saw the protection of civilians pursued within the Security Council and the creation of peacekeeping missions with robust protection mandates. And you had, on the other hand, the General Assembly owning the development and the discussion of the responsibility to protect. The two norms also came to have a very uneasy relationship at times. Protection of civilians was seen as very specific to peacekeeping, as less controversial than the responsibility to protect, which invoked this question of the legitimacy of intervention for humanitarian purposes. But interestingly, I think now in our current macro-normative environment, the two norms have come back together, I think in two interesting respects. First, while they have been institutionalized in important ways, and we can look at doctrine and practices within different institutions that are trying to implement the provisions in both norms, we also see, of course, huge implementation gaps. We see selective application, but also in the case of peacekeeping, interestingly, in protection of civilians, you have mandates to protect and peacekeeping forces deciding not to use force to protect. So even though they are mandated to do so, a reluctance to do so. And secondly, they're both coming back together in their much more state-centric focus. So if you think about the protection imperative that arose out of those failures, I would put to you that it was a much more individualist imperative, that we should have in the international community a concern not just with the security of states, but with the security of individuals inside states. And what we've seen with both of these agendas over the last 5 to 8 years is, as they've been interpreted by states and they've been put into practice, we've emphasized more the state-centric elements of the norm. And what do I mean by that? That states are the primary agents of protection, that the goal of international actors should be to enhance state capacity, that it should be states who request international assistance, consent to it, rather than it being enforced upon them. Now, it all makes sense, but we need to remember that just as states are protectors, they can also be perpetrators of violence against civilian populations. So I think this state-centric focus has a Janus face. Now, why have these two trends occurred, the implementation gap and the state-centric focus? I think there are many reasons, but I think there are two that when we think about our macro context today, we need to keep in mind, and it's what's making the protection of civilians so challenging in our current context. First is, of course, much starker geopolitical differences. So where we might have seen the environment 10 years ago, 15 years ago as being more permissive for collective international action, more intense geopolitical rivalry is making that more difficult. Easier for states to say, either because their allies or in some cases their proxies are resisting collective international action, to refrain from pushing for or even just consenting to collective action at the international level. And secondly, and I think this is similar to a point of Yanina's, I've come to think that this is actually a cognitive development. Many actors in the international community, in the UN system, but also collectivities of states, have become biased towards the costs of action. If we act, if we intervene, look at the mess we create. Look at the unintended consequences. Look at the damage we do. And there's been an inclination, because the costs of action are so much more powerful cognitively than the costs of inaction, to prioritize the costs of action and to minimize the costs of inaction. So decision makers don't, I believe, routinely ask themselves, if we don't act robustly, what will be the costs? What will be the consequences? They are obsessed with the costs of action. And I think this is a feature of our contemporary international system. So much for the macro context. At the more intermediate level, I think we are seeing I'm going to use the word very, but it's an understatement, a very disturbing trend towards increased lack of compliance with IHL, and an abandonment in many respects of a more robust conception of protection. We see this through the race to the bottom in the strategies of belligerence, where we see starvation as a tactic. We're not even talking about civilians being attacked through collateral damage or unintended harm, but a specific strategy of belligerence to attack particular sections of the population. We've seen this in Syria, we've seen this in Yemen, and I think in some ways we've become immune to it at the international level. Part of this is as a result of the new urban context for many of the conflicts we're seeing. So you have bombardment of urban areas, you have particular strategies of war in urban contexts. But, and I think this is also important to consider, we have a blurring of categories. It's easier to attack civilians if you don't consider them to be civilians. If we stretch our categories, if we start talking about different types of civilians, guilty civilians. Remember, for decades in history, civilians have always been suspected, right? They're not really innocent. How does the Syrian regime refer to the people inside rebel-held territories? They're all terrorists. They're not civilians. So the blurring of these categories, and on the other side, you saw, and although this isn't a practice now, you saw in the use of drone strikes that we have anyone in the area of combatants are considered to be combatants. So I think these trends are very, very formidable challenges to the protection of civilians in a current context where we're seeing belligerent behavior that does not give us hope with respect to compliance with IHL. And I think a last feature that I'd like to highlight here at this intermediate level is that we have many situations where we have violent death, individuals not being protected, but they're not formal armed conflicts. So there's a very interesting study that comes out every 5 years out of Geneva, the global burden of armed violence. And what you see is that while there's roughly 500,000 people who die violent deaths in situations of lethal violence, only 10% of those are in formal armed conflicts. The context where we see greater numbers of death, Honduras, Mexico, Guatemala, where we don't have formal armed conflict, but where we have what the ICRC calls situations other than war. But where, very interestingly, the ICRC is present as an actor trying to protect populations. But it has to do so under a different legal framework and a different set of rules. And I think if you just want to talk about numbers of killed and the context in which we find ourselves, formal armed conflict is only a very small, I wouldn't say small, but partial piece of the puzzle. Last level, the very micro level. And here I want to refer to the work of one of our ELAC fellows, Rebecca, who's just taking a picture right now. And that's the question of, if we really want to examine civilian protection, how do we understand how civilians today are currently protecting themselves? Because while the international community or external actors or armed groups or militaries agonize about what they should do or not do to protect communities, communities themselves are doing a great deal to protect themselves. And political science as a field in the last decade has become intrigued by this question of civilian self-protection strategies. Sometimes it involves cooperating with armed groups. Sometimes it involves non-cooperation. And there's interesting studies of the different strategies communities use and under what conditions they are effective. Now, most of these strategies that have been looked at are strategies to protect communities from immediate physical violence. But what we've been doing within ELAC and some of our projects and our ERC project is looking at a broader set of civilian self-protection strategies. And so the work of Rebecca and her colleague Emily Padden-Rhodes has looked at community justice mechanisms as a form of self-protection. So if you look at the protection of civilian sites today in South Sudan, so the United Nations created sites called protection of civilian sites, where many civilians have fled in the context of that conflict. They've now been living for months, in some cases years, in this setting. But in situations of displacement, there's a whole host of new protection challenges. And I'm not just talking about disease. I'm just talking more about criminality, but also sexual violence, other forms of intimidation. And here we see populations living in very insecure conditions. But they're not passive victims. They're actually taking efforts to protect themselves in these situations. Now, in a context where the international community prefers inaction, non-intervention, because it's very costly, it's very attractive for international actors to say, so maybe what we should be doing is supporting these self-protection strategies. Less costly. It doesn't mean a big footprint from us. Surely our role now should be to enhance the success of civilian self-protection. But I think these strategies, and Rebecca and Emily point this out in their work, but I've seen it in other contexts as well, they pose challenges for international actors like the United Nations. And I'm going to finish with a few of these that Emily and Rebecca have actually identified. First of all, there are different conceptions of protection at work between an entity like the United Nations and its mission in South Sudan and civilian communities themselves. So, for example, UNMISS has been unwilling to consider adultery and elopement as punishable offenses in the POC sites. But yet, from the perspective of the community, these are issues that involve protection. So, different conceptions of protection. Secondly, within community justice mechanisms, community watch groups, community courts, not all members of the community are necessarily included. It's not always an inclusive conception of justice. You can have old divisions represented in civilian self-protection strategies. Thirdly, there's a lack of accountability for senior community figures who might be involved in designing and administering these protection strategies. And then lastly, which I think is perhaps most interesting, but not unique to this particular situation, it's a common challenge for the United Nations, is that interacting with these popular and community justice practices really implicates the relationships between international actors and parties to the conflict. So where the United Nations for example, elects to support a civilian self-protection strategy, a community watch group, a community court in the POC site, this carries the risk of antagonizing the government, state actors, who might rightly question what the UN's role is when it's operating on its sovereign territory. So when I raise this last, more micro conception of civilian self-protection, I raise it as a promising area, but unfortunately, it also comes with a whole host of challenges for external actors who might be trying to understand how effective those strategies are, but also how to support them. And I'll stop there.
All right, our final speaker is Dapo Akande.
Thank you. So I want to talk about the access of civilians in armed conflict to food, water, medicines, and other supplies that are indispensable for the survival of the civilian population as an aspect of the protection of civilians in conflict. So over the last decade or thereabouts, the UN Secretary General issues an annual report to the Security Council on the protection of civilians in conflict. And the Secretary General has identified 5 core challenges to the protection of civilians, which include some of the things that Yanina and Jennifer have been talking about. But one of those 5 core challenges is improving access for humanitarian operations in armed conflict. And for those of us who study the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on issues to do with targeting of combatants and civilians. We tend to put a lot of emphasis on killings. We tend to put a lot of emphasis on the protection of what in a human rights context you might regard as civil and political rights, issues of detention, those sorts of things. But in the vast majority of armed conflicts, most of the people who die in armed conflicts do not die because they have been the subject of lethal force. Most of the people who die because of a lack of access to food, to water, to medicines, to shelter. And you open any sort of textbook or any book on international humanitarian law, IHL, and you will find very little on this in most of these books. I mean, I have taught a course here on international humanitarian law. By here, I mean in Oxford, in the university, on which includes international humanitarian law. And I've never taught a class on issues to do with humanitarian access, issues to do with starvation, which Jennifer mentioned. But thankfully, the lack of attention that has thus far been paid to these issues is changing. I speak about the Secretary General's annual report, but also more generally within the Security Council, within the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, there has been more focus that has been paid to these issues of humanitarian access. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that some of us in ELAC, particularly Emanuela Gillard, who's not here, and myself have been doing on these issues relating to humanitarian relief operations. About 5 years ago, in one of those reports that I mentioned, the UN Secretary General asked the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, to analyze or to provide some analysis and options for guidance on the legal framework regulating humanitarian relief operations. And this was, at the time, what I think we would have described as the height of the crisis in Syria. But of course, it has reached even I was going to say greater, but that's the wrong word, further heights, I suppose, since then. So UN OCHA then commissioned ELAC to look at this area of law, and Manu Gillard and I led this process. We went through a process of consultations with experts from various humanitarian organizations, from the UN and academics, and we produced this document, which is called the Oxford Guidance on the Law Relating to Humanitarian Relief Operations in Situations of Armed Conflict, which seeks to set out what the law is in this area. The overarching framework of the law in this area is actually relatively simple, and there are four sort of general principles that one might say provide a framework for the law relating to humanitarian relief operations. Number one, that responsibility for meeting the needs of the civilian population lies with the party in whose territory or under whose control those civilians are. This comes from both international humanitarian law as well as human rights law. Number two, in situations where a civilian population is inadequately supplied with food or water or other objects that are indispensable for their survival, offers to conduct relief operations which are humanitarian, exclusively humanitarian and impartial in character may be made, and that's by civil society organizations, it may be by international organizations, or it may even be by states. So that's number two. Number three, such operations, so such humanitarian relief operations, may only be carried out subject to the consent of the state on whose territory the operations are to be carried out. And then if I can add a 3B, however, such consent must not be arbitrarily withheld. And then number four, in the implementation of these humanitarian relief operations, the parties to an armed conflict have an obligation to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of relief supplies, equipment, and personnel. But again, if I can add a B, so a 4B, however, the parties to the armed conflict may prescribe technical arrangements for such passage. And as you can imagine, it is in those areas that I have indicated that there's a B where most of the controversy arises. So you have these sort of four overarching principles, but of course, I think similar to the point that Yanina was making about law providing action guidance, but where you then have lack of clarity in the law, which sort of impinges on the ability to have that guidance. So where are the real pressure points in this legal framework and in this legal regime that seems very, very simple? There are a number of questions that we look at in this document, but there are three that I just want to pick up on where we have seen most of the challenges in this apparently simple framework. So I said with number three that operations are subject to the consent of the state in whose territory they operate. One of the key questions that has arisen there is the question of whose consent is required for the conduct of humanitarian relief operations in non-international armed conflicts, which are the vast majority of armed conflicts that we have in the world. Particularly in cases where you have a non-international armed conflict between a state and a non-state group, or even between two non-state groups, where part of the territory of a state is under the effective control of a non-state group, and where it is possible to access that territory that's controlled by the non-state group from outside the country, so to come directly without passing territory that is subject to the control of the state. So this was an issue that the UN faced and other humanitarian organizations faced in Syria, the possibility of engaging in so-called cross-border relief operations. So could you go in directly from Turkey, for example, into those parts of Syria that were not under the control of the Assad government? And here the law is not so clear, at least at first glance, the law is not so clear. Because if you look at Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, it provides that humanitarian organizations may offer their services to the parties to the armed conflict. And this is in the context of a non-international armed conflict. So the question that then arises is, okay, if you make your offer of services to a non-state actor and they accept, do you still need the consent of the state to come in? And the legal analysis is complicated by the fact that if you then look at the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, additional protocol 2 of 1977, there's a specific provision that deals with this. It's Article 18, and it talks about humanitarian relief operations that are carried out subject to the consent of the high contracting party concerned. So essentially, you have a choice here in trying to interpret what the law says. That if you make, under Common Article 3, an offer of services to a non-state group, once they accept it, then IHL effectively authorizes this operation, or on the other hand, relying on the consent of the state. In our work and in the discussions that we had with others in our work, we came to the view that actually the territorial sovereignty of the state is such an important principle in international law that one could not interpret Common Article 3 as implicitly doing away with the principle of consent. And this is further strengthened by that provision that I mentioned in the additional protocols, because the understanding of the additional protocols is that they only add to the rights of civilians or the protection of civilians. And it would be odd if we were to interpret it as, in this particular case, taking away from a protection that was already conferred on by Common Article 3. So this then leads to the second big question. So if you say that the consent of the state is required, I said in listing those principles that there's a B, which is that such consent must not be arbitrarily withheld. And the questions that arise there are twofold. First of all, where does this principle of arbitrary withholding of consent come from? And secondly, what does it mean? So over the last 5 years or thereabouts, primarily in the context of dealing with the situation in Syria, we have begun to see use of this language of arbitrary withholding of consent in various Security Council resolutions, resolutions of the Human Rights Council, and other bodies as well. Now, the text of the relevant treaties do not actually include this wording, that consent must not be arbitrarily withheld. But we came to the conclusion that international law requires that consent not be arbitrarily withheld for a number of reasons. First of all, from the need to provide an effective interpretation of the relevant treaty text. So if you look at the relevant treaty text, there is an apparent contradiction in them, particularly Additional Protocol 1, which provides that in circumstances where civilians are inadequately supplied, humanitarian relief operations shall be conducted, it says. But then it goes on to say, subject to the consent of the state concerned. So you have, it seems that you have two things. One, they shall be carried out, but on the other hand, that it's subject to the consent. And so any interpretation which seeks to prioritize one aspect of these two parts of that text would seem to be inconsistent with the text. And this principle that consent shall not be arbitrarily withheld seems to provide an appropriate balance between those two aspects. Secondly, if you look at the drafting history of the additional protocols, you can see this element that consent must not be arbitrarily withheld reflected in the drafting history, and it was unopposed at the time. And then thirdly, there is practice subsequent to the adoption of these additional protocols in which this principle is embedded. So that's where it comes from. Then the big question is, what does it mean? What does it mean to say that consent must not be arbitrarily withheld? There are a number of situations where international law uses the notion of arbitrariness. And I think it's important to recognize that arbitrariness in almost all of those contexts, if not all, does not quite mean exactly what the word appears to suggest. So arbitrariness appears to suggest something that is unreasoned, something that is capricious, but this is not the way in which it is used in international law more generally. And more generally, conduct under international law is arbitrary if it falls into one of three sort of categories. So first of all, where the conduct would be inconsistent with other obligations under international law. So where withholding consent would result in the violation by a state or a party to the armed conflict of its obligations under international law, other obligations with respect to the civilian population, then it would be arbitrary. So for example, obligations to prohibit starvation, or for example, obligations that prohibit discrimination, or for example, obligations that require parties to allow medical access, even to combatants of the other side. So where withholding consent would have the effect of violating any of these other obligations, then it would be arbitrary. Secondly, withholding of consent would be arbitrary in circumstances where this would violate the principles of necessity and proportionality. In other words, even in circumstances where a state might have a legitimate aim, it must not take action which goes beyond that which is necessary to accomplish that aim, and which goes beyond that which would be proportionate in the accomplishment of that aim. And then thirdly, you have arbitrariness in the narrow meaning, which is the more general meaning of arbitrariness, that withholding of consent would be arbitrary if the manner in which the consent is withheld is unreasonable or unjust or lacking in predictability, so something that's akin to capriciousness. Final point, and I will just raise this very quickly, the final challenge that arises in relation to the application of these rules is what happens if a state acts unlawfully under these rules. So if a state, for example, were to withhold consent arbitrarily, or if a state, for example, were to act unlawfully in imposing these technical arrangements that I spoke about in relation to passage, does this then mean that others who wish to engage in these humanitarian relief operations can go in? So this was another issue that was faced in Syria. If the state is acting unlawfully, can the UN go in? Can NGOs go in? What does the law say there? And here I think one has to address this from the perspective of both international humanitarian law as well as from a broader international law perspective. So international humanitarian law as a body of law does not in itself provide a remedy for the violation of these principles that I've just been talking about. So as a matter of international humanitarian law, because the state has acted unlawfully, that does not in itself authorize others to go in. However, under international law more broadly, one might be able to look at principles in the law of state responsibility which might provide some possibilities, and in particular, one might be able to look at what are known as circumstances precluding wrongfulness under the law of state responsibility, particularly the principle of necessity and the principle of countermeasures, as in narrow circumstances authorizing states to go in where there has been a breach of these principles.
All right, thank you so much. Dapo, we have half an hour, correct?
A bit less.
A bit less,
yeah.
20 minutes, okay. For questions, please introduce yourself before you ask a question.
There is a mic.
All right, yeah, there it is. Depending on how many questions we have, I might resort to taking them sort of in blocks of 3, but why don't we start with one at a time? The gentleman over here.
Sure, okay, so I'm running away from that.
Sorry, I should have strategically chosen someone on that end of the room.
The event is being live streamed, so that's why we need the mic, so that the question can be captured.
So hi, I'm Christian. I'm an MBA student here. I kind of wish I was at this place, to be honest, but anyways. My question is about, I guess for me, when I've studied just war theory and things like that, when we were talking, or when you all were talking about the moral permissibility of starving out civilians in armed conflict. And I guess my initial cognitive dissonance that comes along with that is, let's say you have countries X and Y, and country X commits an act of aggression against country Y, and they're going to respond, with their just cause or whatever it may be. Given that not all belligerents have an all-volunteer force of combatants and things like that, what's the principal difference that makes starving out civilians so much less permissible than going out with a kinetic attack that would kill, I don't know, let's say, however many combatants that is in the other, that's in the other side? It doesn't necessarily, I guess it's not as clear to me why that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take it?
Do you want to start?
I mean, there are basically two questions baked into this one, right? One is on what moral grounds do we distinguish between civilians and combatants if combatants are conscripted, coerced by circumstances, have no choice, or if they fight a just war, right? This is one of the questions. The other one is starving someone worse than killing them, right? Or is it worse than harming? Is it a particular type of harming? I haven't thought in a sustained way about the latter question, but I would say that as a form of harming, starving is certainly, on the worse end. And I think there's a way in which you could think about it that it can be worse than killing if you think about it in terms of torture, right? Really using someone's most basic needs against them for coercive purposes. That there is something worse, that the imprint that leaves in the moral universe is worse or deeper than simply the imprint of morally wrongful harm, the outcome of harm. But I haven't thought about this in a sustained way, whether starving is a form of torture or whether it is simply a form of harming. The other question is the slightly more complex question of under what circumstances should we critically rethink the notion that we should never harm civilians at the expense of combatants, or that we always can put burdens on combatants for the purpose of harming civilians. And I think there we simply go to the problematic issue that the distinction between civilians and combatants traces morally relevant categories, but traces them very, very imperfectly. So in any given war, it's possible that some civilians are liable to moral harm, and many, many combatants won't be liable to moral harm, right? And this is simply a problem that law cannot on its own resolve. And the bottom line of this is that obeying law, I think, is the morally right course of action, particularly if in the epistemic circumstances of a war you cannot possibly determine the moral status of an individual, right? But it isn't really the be and end all of the moral question of permissibility of harming, right? That even obeying the law, complying with the law, you will often harm people who are not morally liable to the harm that you impose. Right?
Yeah, so just to say, on the second part of the question about starvation and whether there is something about starvation which is worse. So just to respond to that by reference to what international humanitarian law provides for. Of course, once we're talking about the category of civilians, then it would also be impermissible to target them with lethal force, to make them the object of the attack. And so in that sense, you have some degree of symmetry. It's impermissible to make them the object of an attack with lethal force. It's impermissible to sort of starve them out. But actually, there's some complications in the law which I think we're only just starting to turn our attention to as far as the law is concerned. So international humanitarian law has a number of principles that apply to attacks. And one of the things that is not quite clear is when you take action which has the result of starving civilians, is that an attack that is subject to the application of these principles? So Janina talked in her presentation about proportionality, and that's a principle that applies in the conduct of hostilities, but it applies in the course of an attack. Can we apply this same principle more generally to other things that you do? For example, issues of starvation. That there are just some wrinkles there in the law which are still not quite clear.
Did you want to come in? Okay, next question. Yeah, the lady in the blue pullover.
Thank you. My name's Liz Carmichael. I'm an emeritus fellow at St. John's. Thank you for 3 very clear presentations. The category of innocence seems to be quite fundamental to what we're talking about, and also perhaps the category of civilian, who is a civilian and who is not. And I wonder if you could dig deeper. What is an innocent civilian? Are they defined in international humanitarian law? If not, should they be? And as Jennifer brought up the problem that the whole category of an innocent civilian is contested. If one defines people living in a certain area or people of a certain ethnicity and so on as all being enemy and therefore not innocent. So I just wonder if you could just help me with that.
Do you want to start, Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a legal answer to this, which probably Dapo and Janina are better at giving, but I'll give it a shot. is, we have the method that is used to most often to make this distinction is about direct participation in hostilities, which helps you to determine who is a combatant and who is a non-combatant. And I'm not saying that that's an easy determination always to make, but that's the mechanism that in the law tries to make the distinction. So as far as I'm aware, but Dapo can correct me, there isn't a legal notion of innocent or not innocent civilian. There is a combatant or a non-combatant. We don't take the extra step of trying to probe whether they're really innocent or partially culpable. But the reason I raised it was to try to describe part of the rationale, or perhaps more to the point, the justification of current belligerence, right? So when Yanina paints a picture of what publics or what militaries do, so publics would like to fight a war that is in conformity with the law, I absolutely have no doubt. But in the political world that we live in, belligerents will paint their struggle in such a way that I think populations over which they rule will come to believe that a group inside a city is not really innocent civilians. And so despite what the law might say, there is a power that belligerents are able to draw from that. Now, does that mean that they are not infringing the law? Of course not. But what I'm trying to do there is to give you a sense of the political nature of the wars in which, and the conflicts in which we see civilians harmed. So where I think you find this conception of innocence more directly in your question is when we look back in time to the way that people historically talked about populations who were not combatants. I mean, as Hugo's work shows, the term civilian is relatively recent, right? The key distinctions were about who was a combatant and who was a non-combatant, but this concept of the civilian, this ethically laden notion, was something that came relatively recently. So you have in early just war thinking, you have in philosophical treaties, the concept of the innocent. But I think in contemporary law, that distinction is not made. It's simply, are you a direct participant in hostilities or aren't you? And we're not going to probe further into your quality within those. Yanina refers, very interestingly, to the move in revisionist just war theory to say, we have no quibble with the law that says we have a category of combatant. Our argument is whether all combatants are the same in terms of their liability to be harmed. So there you have these distinctions being drawn in the other category. So we may have combatants, in their view, who are not liable to harm because of actions they take or do not take. But the law doesn't make those further determinations. But you guys will correct me if I'm wrong.
So if you take those two words, innocent, civilian, and you start with the word civilian, so the question is, who is a civilian? As a matter of the law, it's sort of relatively easy. Relatively easy in the sense that a civilian is somebody who's not a combatant. Okay, but then where does that get you? But that's an important point.
Yeah.
It actually, it sounds unhelpful, but it's actually a very important point because what it shows is that there's no middle category. There's no middle category. So if you are not a combatant, you are by definition a civilian, and therefore you're entitled to certain protections. Here, the distinction between international or interstate, if you like, armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts is also crucial. In an international armed conflict, it's relatively easy to say who a combatant is, a member of the armed forces of the states. Easy. In a non-international armed conflict, to answer the question who a combatant is, even that term is not quite accurate, or who a fighter is, becomes a lot more complicated because, yes, on the state side it's easy, but on the side of the non-state group it is not so easy. So that's where the complication comes in. And then just on the thing of the innocent, again, for the purposes of the law, it depends on for what purpose. And I think it's really important to emphasize that, because we tend to think that this is something that cuts across all actions in armed conflicts. It depends on what we're talking about. Are we talking about for the purposes of targeting, killing somebody, for the purposes of detention, for the purposes of prosecution? And those lines do not fall in the same place. So for the purpose of targeting, it's about direct participation in hostilities. But for the purposes of detaining somebody without trial, without just detaining them, that's a completely different question. Yeah.
So the bottom line is that law diverges from the moral distinction between innocence and guilt or culpability, but it does so for very good moral reasons, right? That it would be truly disastrous if law addressed the soldier on the battlefield by saying, you can kill everyone on the other side who is morally liable to harm and protect only those who are innocent, because we simply don't have the capacity to determine that. As Jennifer suggests, we often think of the other side as guilty, right? So it's a good approximation to a moral, underlying, meaningful moral distinction, but it is the distinction that law draws isn't the same as the distinction that morality draws. Okay, I think I should probably take 3 questions at a time, so I'll say Elizabeth, the gentleman, and then the lady behind, and I think probably that's the time we have, right? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Stubbins-Bates. I'm a junior research fellow in law at Merton College. I'm also a research fellow here and at the Boniverio Institute for Human Rights. And I have a question for you, Janina. I'm wondering if your framework of high compliance cost and a utilitarian calculation, and then the cognitive and affective biases caused by war upon actors in war, whether that accounts sufficiently and fully for violations of international humanitarian law that are deliberate and that perhaps are systematic or policy-driven. And I was wondering if those intentional violations might have an opposite causal chain, whereby pre-existing human evil, perhaps, or pre-existing specific intent to commit a particular violation of international law, then operates upon war, which then creates the conditions through those cognitive biases, through those affective biases, to continue the violations. But in fact, in that instance, it's humans' moral failings operating on war, rather than war creating the conditions for humans' moral failings.
Okay. Yeah. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Tobin Nelly. I am a student here at the Blavatnik School. So my question is about the possibility of a situation of an asymmetrical warfare, whereby the weaker side, for example, adopts guerrilla tactics. So is there any mechanism, or maybe within the international law, that would ensure that civilians are protected? Because probably the combatants find a way of attacking the other side and then infusing themselves back within the society. Are there any mechanisms that could possibly ensure that civilians on the other side are protected?
Thanks. My name's Emma. I'm a humanitarian policy advisor at Oxfam. Thanks very much. Really interesting. And perhaps this is more of an observation than a question, but we've talked a lot about IHL today. I'm thinking about places like northeastern Nigeria, where there's been no declaration of a non-international armed conflict, so we're not under IHL. And also areas of the Sahel, for example, where there's a lot of fragility at the moment and a lot of a need to protect civilians, and there's a lot of failure to protect civilians in these areas. So, I mean, a lot of this would be around the rise of, going back to the point about state sovereignty, particularly. But it'd be good to hear your thoughts on the use of IHL in many of these contexts, and what concrete actions can be taken to enhance protection of civilians. So, for example, working with the G5, has been quite difficult to get them to protect civilians better and to integrate that. For example, going to other contexts in Africa, DRC, it's very difficult to use IHL in any sense at all to improve protection. I feel a lot of our debates about protecting civilians come back to the Middle East at the moment, where there's a very different global context and a very different application of the law. So it'd be really interesting to hear any thoughts on that.
Okay, shall we take a round of responses? Dapo, do you want to start? And then I go to you.
So to start with the question of the gentleman about asymmetric warfare and mechanisms for ensuring protection of civilians, there, in a way, it's actually very similar to the question that was just asked. So here we're talking about non-international armed conflicts between usually a state and a non-state armed group, and just taking the two things together. So the first thing that I would say is that the fact that the state, or even the non-state side, and usually the non-state side, does not recognize that they are in an armed conflict, obviously makes it much more difficult to invoke IHL, either in advocacy or in other contexts, but does not mean that IHL does not apply. So if we take what's happening in northeastern Nigeria with the Boko Haram, it's undoubtedly the case that we are seeing a non-international armed conflict, and therefore the rules of international humanitarian law apply. So one thing that I think has made it much easier to invoke international humanitarian law in many of these contexts now is actually international criminal law. In the sense that if you take, for example, Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, so Nigeria is a situation that is now under the preliminary examination of the International Criminal Court. So the International Criminal Court is looking at the situation and is considering whether war crimes are being committed, both by the state and also by the non-state side, which makes it much more difficult, actually, for the Nigerian government to say, no, there is no non-international armed conflict, because they have to respond to these allegations of war crimes. And so even though international criminal law doesn't always provide the answer, but very often it provides the focus, actually, for saying that, yes, there is an armed conflict and you have these obligations under international humanitarian law. And just quickly, the point on how do you sort of protect civilians in asymmetric warfare. I mean, by asymmetric, I assume you're not just talking about the fact that it's a state and a non-state group, but also talk about the fact that one side has as a specific strategy the rejection of any of these principles, right? So they are actually using, attack against civilians as one of their methods. That's a very difficult question, and the question essentially boils down to how do you deal with parties who do not intend to comply with the law. That's essentially what it boils down to, and you just have to fall back on the points that Yanina made earlier. International law here in terms of mechanisms is sort of uneven, but there are some, international criminal law, pressure from the international community, and also...
And international criminal law.
Yeah, and international, that's right.
In some contexts.
Yes.
With individuals in non-state armed groups, right? So you have some, yeah.
Do you want to add?
Just maybe two of the questions. First, thank you for your observation and your question. It was partly why I wanted to hint at the global burden of armed violence, that study, because I think you're absolutely right that there tends to be, we look at the prism of deaths of populations who are not actively involved in fighting. That's why I'm using that phrase rather than war. More by looking at Yemen, Syria today, and I think you're right, do not look more broadly to the other contexts. ELAC and the ERC project is about to have, in 3 weeks' time, a workshop in Mexico City. And in preparation for that, we've had an extremely interesting debate back and forth about this context, because you've had some organizations, IISS and the Geneva War Report, declare that certain aspects of the violence in Mexico do constitute an armed conflict between the state security forces and one of the cartels, and among some of the cartels. It's very controversial. But what we've found interesting in working with our local partner who's writing a paper for us is he said, look, in the interviews that I've conducted and the people I've talked with in the human rights community and in the protection community, they have not wanted to invoke IHL, partly because they came of age as organizations in an era of human rights activism. That's the language and framework that they believe best advances protection, but also because they believe that the right to life that is fundamental to international human rights law is the prism through which they should try to advance protection. Because IHL also has, if you invoke it, some unintended consequences in terms of the rights and responsibilities it gives to parties, including state armed forces. So I think it's a really interesting question about when you begin to ask, in these contexts, what do activists themselves believe the most promising framework is for advancing protection? Just coming back, I think it was Emma's question. This issue about how we think about socialization and compliance in contexts where these strategies are deliberate. And of course, that's true of many non-state armed groups. And even more sinister than that, there are some who join non-state armed groups because it enables them to engage in actions, particularly I'm thinking of sexual slavery, that they would like to engage in, right? So this is all very deliberate. The only thing I'd say, and this comes from some of my experiences when I was working as a special advisor, I found that states were often very, in my view, conveniently pointing the finger at non-state armed groups as the deviant actor in conflict that uses these sorts of strategies deliberately. And it was actually a lawyer from the ICRC that says, just be careful accepting that line, because it is still states and governments themselves who are the greatest violators of some of these principles. And it is because they are using attacks on civilian populations as a deliberate strategy. And so we need to understand more about why that is. But I think it's interesting, the lens you brought to it, that it's more those pre-existing views, which are sometimes ethnically defined, identity-based, are then put in the context of war rather than it being the other way around.
Yeah, just to add to this, I mean, the notion of cognitive biases obviously, becomes salient if we think of someone as a good faith actor who tries to obey the law. Yeah. The notion of compliance failures doesn't necessarily, right? The idea that there's a compliance cost could simply mean that you cannot do the deviant goal that you have in the first instance, right? And I agree with you, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the incidence of war is a moral failure, and in its expression, to some extent, of the same problems that are simply, sort of front-loaded. They appear before we even end up in a war, right? A war is always, on at least one side, a compliance failure with the general prohibition on the use of force in international law, right? And again, there are similar issues that, the incentive structures that international law has put in place are very, very important for potentially reducing the incidence of war, but they are not perfect and they haven't managed to eradicate war, right? That our primary moral, duty and imperative is to avoid war is absolutely, evident to me if we understand that wars can never be fully just, right? They're at best ever justified as a lesser evil, right? So, of course, we now have chosen as our topic the protection of civilians once we are in an armed conflict. But absolutely the question of how can we avoid war, how can we reduce the incidence of war is as morally important. The only thing where I would push it back against what you said a little bit is the notion that these cognitive failures or volitional defects are the same before war and in war. I really don't think we should let policymakers off the hook, right? I don't think they operate in the same fog of epistemic fog and under the same pressures as a soldier on the battlefield. And precisely because it is such a unique situation for a soldier on the battlefield to be in, where it's generally intractable to understand what is right and wrong and what is, how to proceed, to the extent that we recognize that to be the case, right, that makes it even more urgent to avoid us ending up in wars in the first place. And I think with that, it leaves for me to thank you all for coming out on a Friday to our second event, ELAC event of the term, and we hope to see you all again for the remaining ELAC events this year. Thank you.